Now that we're reasonably familiar with most of HTML's important elements, let's get started with CSS, this time in earnest. First though, a recap. You might recall that we've already encountered CSS. We spoke about how the HTML on a page was like a skeleton providing content and structure. But in order to get the look and feel right, we still needed styles. And this is something that we achieve using Cascading Stylesheets, aka CSS. Remember that a style is little more than a rule. It's a rule which dictates how an HTML element should look when rendered in the browser. The Cascading Stylesheet language allows us to specify these rules in a relatively easy and extensible manner. We had also created our first page style. This was in example 2. What we did there was to take a bare bones HTML page which we had created in the preceding example and then add a few simple rules which we saw transform the appearance of the page. The key element that we added was the style element. This is what contained all of the rules. This was a style element in the HTML where we specified that the type was text CSS. Again, style is a tag that told the browser that we were specifying styles or rules that governed this particular HTML page. The type attribute specified what kind of styles we plan to use. In this instance, as is almost invariably the case, we were using text/CSS styles. We also created a few simple styles and these dramatically changed how our HTML page looked. Remember that these are specified in CSS, which is a completely different language than HTML. It looks different and is somewhat intimidating in its syntax. Here are a bunch of styles, i.e. rules, on screen now. The first part of the style is the selector. Here, the body is selected. It's telling us that this style is going to apply to the HTML element called body. Let's quickly jog our memories about what each of these rules actually mean. You might recall that the change in appearance was quite dramatic, and that's because these rules governed a whole bunch of different aspects of the appearance of the page. The first rule on screen specifies that the background color ought to be a particular shade of red. Again, the background color is specified using the background-color property name. The value that we specified for this property name was the hexadecimal color code BE1515. This corresponds to the rich red that you see in the page. We also specified that the color property ought to be white. This governs the color of the font and other text elements on the HTML page. Next up, we specified two margins, the top and the left margin. These properties, which are specified in terms of pixels, govern the gap that is left between the HTML text and the edges of the browser window. And after this, we had also specified the padding, which specified the gap to be left inside the text element. And lastly, we also specified that the font family ought to be Arial. Together, all of these rules completely changed the way our simple HTML page looked from the previous example. Let's now build on this knowledge of styles and let's see how we can get a lot more done using the Cascading Stylesheet language. The first important bit that we are going to work on is removing the CSS from the HTML file into a separate CSS file. This is going to be our next example. And this is a pretty important point because in general, the folks who write CSS are designers and they may be different from the folks who write the HTML code. Let's return now to the example which we just recapitulated. There, we specified our styles using a style tag inside the HTML file itself. The CSS was embedded within the same HTML page as the rest of the HTML elements which it governed. But here's the thing, a website almost always consists of far more than just one page. So we are going to have a whole bunch of HTML pages and presumably we want all of those pages to share the same styles. How would we go about accomplishing this? Well, we could copy paste the CSS from this HTML page onto every other HTML page. But hopefully by now you've realized that anytime you have to copy paste something, that should give you pause. If you found a bug in whatever it is that you copy pasted, you would then need to cycle through all of the files where you copy pasted and make the change. In general, we should be looking to make any code that we write modular and pluggable, so that it's written in one place and applies to a whole bunch of places. Well, that begs the question, how could we make our CSS code modular and pluggable? And it turns out that there is a convenient answer in HTML. HTML affords a very convenient way of factoring our CSS styles, the rules that is, into a separate file. This file, which we in this example will call example8.css, is a separate file. Again, we just simply move all of the rules, the styles from our CSS style element into a separate CSS file. Now, any HTML element which wants to refer to this style sheet can simply do so using a very handy HTML tag called the link tag. This is a way for any HTML page to say, this here is the CSS file that I would like to work with. For this, we no longer need the style tag at all. Again, we get rid of the style tag, we move the CSS code into a separate file, and we now link to the CSS file so that it is automatically referenced from our HTML page. How do we link to this CSS file, you ask? Well, the answer is using a link HTML element. We will talk about the link element in a second, but before that, understand what's really going on. Now, we've moved the CSS into a separate file and we've made it possible for any number of HTML files to refer to this CSS file. Let's also take a second now to understand this link element or the link tag which we have encountered for the first time. The link tag, as its name would suggest, links to an external resource. The tag is called link. It has a bunch of attributes. The first of these attributes is the type. Here, we specify the type to be of text CSS. Don't really bother too much about this attribute. This is a throwback to the old days of HTML. Just set the value to text CSS. The next attribute is the rel attribute. Rel stands for relationship, and it tells us what the relationship is between the HTML file and the file that is being linked to. In this instance, the relationship is a style sheet, and so we set the rel attribute to be equal to style sheet. And then the last attribute is a familiar one. It's the href attribute, which we've already encountered while talking about the a tag and links. We simply specify the file name in this attribute.